Robbie Lawler was always a loose cannon who was quick to take offence. He wasn't a major drug dealer or a top crime boss, but instead he made his name as a reckless and indiscriminate killer, happy to do hits in broad daylight and only showing a brief loyalty to whoever was paying his fee. Any history he might have had with those other petty criminals and thieves he grew up with on the streets of Coolock and Donamead on Dublin's north side didn't interest him. There was no honour or brotherhood or family as far as Lawler was concerned. It was every man for himself, and if that meant friends or colleagues had to go, so be it. He was one of the new breed of hoodlums, that 80s drug kingpin Larry Dunn, the man responsible for introducing heroin to the streets of Dublin, once warned a court about when he was being finally sent down. "If you think we're bad," he famously quipped, "wait till you see what's coming after us." Those who knew him say there's nothing in Lawler's background to indicate that he would grow up to become one of Ireland's most notorious and psychotic killers. It was an ordinary working-class childhood in an area where the vast majority of people do their best to raise their families, doing an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. But there are also those who earn small fortunes doing the grunt work for local criminal gangs. I've talked about this before so many times, how kids in deprived areas can get dazzled with the spoils of crime, the promise of a few quid or pills for keeping lookout, or a decent wedge of cash for passing on drugs to customers. Even more if they're willing to get their hands really dirty, like beating up someone who's fallen behind in their payments. And in some cases, it doesn't take very long before they graduate to the really serious and sinister stuff, becoming a gun for hire, happy to shoot someone dead over often very minor rows or drug debts. And this was Lawler's trajectory. A guy who saw an easy way to make money and was happy to carry out whatever dastardly deed was required of him. Some people, well, they're just born bad. He was also a vain sort who spent a lot of time in the gym and is believed to have been hooked on steroids in an effort to bulk up his frame. Indeed, whenever asked to give his profession for official matters, usually when being arrested for questioning over a crime, he described himself as an unemployed personal trainer. Steroids weren't the only drugs he indulged in. His fondness for cocaine also helped contribute to his volatile and unpredictable nature, especially in the last couple of years. By his late teens, he was already familiar to the Gardaí in North Dublin. His rap sheet would eventually extend to more than 125 convictions, most of them for petty crimes. But there was plenty of serious stuff in there too, enough for him to get sentenced to several spells in jail. It was one of these early prison terms that led to the first murder police suspect him of being directly responsible for. And that is the shooting dead of Mark Byrne in May of 2005. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Double Cross, the Murder of Robbie Lawler, a Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal. Mark Byrne, from Tala in South Dublin, was not the kind of guy you'd want to get on the wrong side of. The 29-year-old had around 25 previous convictions for drugs, assault and robbery, and he was a well-known drug addict and dealer. By the time Lawler made his acquaintance in Wheatfield Prison, Byrne was in the middle of serving a 5-year and 7-month sentence after being convicted in 2001 of a string of robberies. He got his sentence extended by 2 years in 2003 after he dramatically escaped from custody while being brought to a Dublin hospital to get test results. After being transferred from Portlaoise Prison to Dublin's St James's Hospital in January of 2002, on the way back the prison van stopped at a McDonald's to get food for him, but Byrne, rather than being grateful for the treat of some takeaway, instead produced a knife and threatened to stab one of the escorting officers. Byrne made his audacious escape and was unlawfully at large for over a month. True to form, when the Gardaí finally rearrested him, he was driving a stolen car. In the meantime, in 2004, Robbie Lawler was convicted of a public order offence and sent to Wheatfield prison. And while in there, the then 20-year-old somehow managed to get embroiled in a brutal row with Mark Byrne. And it's believed Byrne viciously assaulted Lawler using a makeshift blade. In a move that showed exactly what Lawler was capable of, he bided his time and devised a plan to exact his bloody revenge. Tipped off by inmates, Lawler learned that Byrne, who was due to be permanently released that August, was getting out of Mountjoy prison on a one-day temporary release on the 5th of May 2005. He walked out of the jail at approximately 9:35am and crossed the road to a newsagent's to buy credit for his mobile phone. Once back outside, he was approached by a gunman and shot 3 times in the head and chest. It was less than 10 minutes since he'd left Mountjoy prison.
The murder of Mark Byrne was one of those really cold-blooded killings.
This is Niall Donald, deputy editor of the Sunday World.
Mark Byrne had just got out of prison. He had gone to a shop to buy phone credit. As he was leaving the shop, a gunman who was wearing a baseball cap calmly approached him and shot him at point blank range. He then fell to the ground and the gunman again pumped 2 bullets into him, flipping him over due to the force of the bullets. All of this was done in plain sight. Witnesses later would describe how he was calm, collected, didn't show any fear and escaped.
In the days that followed, 3 men and 2 women were questioned by Gardaí about the cold-blooded shooting which took place on the busy mid-morning streets of Phibsborough on Dublin's north side. But all were released without charge. From almost the beginning, Lawler was suspected of being involved. He was arrested, but there wasn't enough evidence to have him charged. 3 years later, he was the main suspect in yet another brazen attack in broad daylight. This time in a housing estate called Buttercup Park in Darndale on Dublin's north side. The intended victim was 21-year-old Anthony Ayodeji, who is of Lebanese heritage. He was sitting in a car with a friend's 22-month-old baby at around 7pm on the 4th of July 2008 when a gunman fired 5 shots through the driver's seat window. Thankfully, the baby boy was left uninjured, just showered in blood and shattered glass. Ayodeji, however, was critically injured after one of the bullets went through his neck. Miraculously, he survived. There's never been any proper explanation for the attack made public, although Gardaí at the time were said to have been satisfied that it was over a personal grievance with a good old dollop of racism and wasn't linked to gangland activity or drug dealing.
Again, the motive for this shooting seems to have been just a personal grievance between the 2 men. Robbie Lawler had been willing to commit murder because he felt slighted by somebody.
There were also rumours that a close relative of the infant, who was serving a lengthy sentence in prison for a serious crime, went berserk after hearing about the attack. They put out a call for the main suspect, who we now know was Robbie Lawler, to be shot in retaliation. But some of Lawler's criminal associates managed to cool things down. They offered up a sincere apology to the baby's family and claimed that Lawler was clueless as to who the child was. It's safe to assume, however, that the baby's family never forgot the incident, earning Lawler another few mortal enemies. At this stage, Lawler had been in a relationship with a Dublin woman, Rachel Kerwin, for the guts of 2 years. And it was her car that Gardaí believed was used to carry Lawler to and from the scene of the shooting in Buttercup Park. Lawler was arrested on suspicion of being the gunman, and Kerwin was arrested on suspicion of withholding information from the Gardaí. But both were released without charge. On the afternoon of the 30th of March 2009, the body of David Fred Lynch was found by a member of the public in an area of wasteland off Belcamp Lane in Coolock. The 26-year-old drug dealer, who had addresses in Darndale and Ballymun, had been shot 4 times in the head. At first, it was thought that Lynch, who was a well-known thug who had clashed with several members of a rival gang in the Coolock and Darndale area, was killed as part of an ongoing feud. He'd received a series of death threats, one as recently as the previous January. But the Gardaí's attention soon turned once again to Robbie Lawler, who was described as a close associate of Lynch. They arrested Lawler, who was now 25 years old, and his girlfriend in a hotel near the Docklands in Dublin in the early hours of Tuesday morning and brought them for questioning to Coolock and Swords Garda Station. But yet again, they were both released without charge.
The murder of David Fred Lynch, I suppose, shows that other side to Robbie Lawler, where he was willing to kill even people that had been his close friends, had been sort of childhood pals of his.
I think this one really shows his treacherous nature and how he's capable of doing anything. They say keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Yeah, I mean, even just before David Fred Lynch was killed, he told his mother, I'll be back in 10 minutes, I'm going to meet Robbie Lawler. And that just shows how Robbie Lawler was part of his life. What had happened...
They were going to dig up a gun or something, weren't they?
Yes, they were going out to dig up a gun. It was buried in wasteland up in Belcamp. Robbie Lawler, Noel Deans and Fred Lynch. After the gun was dug up, Robbie Lawler used the pistol to shoot Fred Lynch dead. And it is believed that he had been basically taken on a contract because Fred Lynch, who was a sort of low-level drug dealer in the area and had fallen out with a lot of people, that Robbie Lawler killed him for money, despite those years of associations.
So ironically, it's only about a year later when, Deans is out drinking with Mr. Biggs hitman Kenneth Finn, and he starts, he gets drunk and he's openly bragging about where that he'd been with Lawler when Fred Lynch was shot. And that sealed his fate, didn't it? That's
exactly. And Noel Deans was a very chaotic criminal, had spent all of his adult life and much of his teenage years in prison, had mental health issues, was anything but a clever and organised criminal. Basically, he was in the pub, he was mouthing off about the murder of Fred Lynch, what he had seen, was drunk, and Ken Finn had phoned Robbie Lawler to tell him what was going on. And in a sort of split-second decision, Robbie Lawler decided to take out a guy he'd known, again, most of his life because of the fear that he could someday be turned or could someday be used against him in a court of law. He had met him outside the pub. They turned down a laneway and Robbie Lawler, without warning, shot Noel Deans dead.
In a sick twist which illustrated beautifully the kind of inhumane behaviour Lawler was capable of, he called to Dean's mother's house just hours after shooting her son dead to console her. They drank tea together, remembering some of the good times that he'd had with Dean's. It's not hard to imagine how Lawler probably made promises to the distraught mother about finding out who'd killed her son and making sure that they'd pay for the cold-blooded murder. It's thought the hit on Deans was ordered because of a minor drug debt. And yet again, Lawler emerged as the chief suspect, but no charges ever stuck. In between being a gun for hire, Lawler carried out robberies, some of them armed, as well as dealing drugs to make his money. In January 2016, Lawler ended up in the Court of Appeal trying to get some time off a 32-month sentence he'd been handed down after pleading guilty to being in the possession of stolen property. And it gave an insight into the kind of crimes he committed to earn his day-to-day cash.
There was a case involving a robbery in McDonald's in Donamead where Robbie Lawler was pretty much a regular customer. That shows how precarious and impulsive he had become. He had spotted a cash box with about €10,000 worth in cash and basically decided on the spur of the moment to rob it. It wasn't the sort of high-end criminality that we would associate with him taking on hits for hire. This is something done on the spur of the moment to try and feed an immediate need.
I've no doubt the people caught up in that robbery still have nightmares about facing someone like Lawler waving a gun in their face. There was about €10,000 in the cash box, which happened to be fitted with a tracking device, and Gardaí found it later that day in a field at Concealy. A few days later, Gardaí spotted Lawler in Darndale posting a package into a house, and when they recovered it, they found it contained €3,420 in banknotes covered in a blue dye from the McDonald's cash box. Lawler pleaded guilty to possessing the stolen property. He'd literally been caught blue-handed. During his appeal trial in 2016, his lawyer told how he was now 31 years old, had 125 previous convictions, the large majority of which, he said, were for traffic offences. But we know now that Lawler's life of crime was far more malevolent. Indeed, he was, for a short time, right at the centre of some of Ireland's most devastating gang wars. At this point, it's probably a good idea to take a look at what was going on in Ireland's crime scene around this time. It involves a rather large cast of characters, but I'll try and keep it as simple and as relevant to Robbie Lawler as I can. So in March 2016, Vincent Ryan was shot dead in Finglas after being ambushed while sitting in his car outside his girlfriend's house. Of course, that was just 1 month after the notorious Regency Hotel attack, which pitched the Kinahan organised crime group and the Hutch mob against one another in a deadly battle. The 25-year-old was the brother of Alan Ryan, who was a very senior and much feared figure in the real IRA. He was murdered close to his home in Clongriffin in North Dublin in 2012. It's thought the brothers were responsible for keeping the peace between the drug gangs in Dublin and beyond, while also extorting the dealers for vast sums of cash. With them out of the way, the power balance shifted to a major drug dealer, who's rather imaginatively referred to as Mr. Big. For legal reasons, he's never been allowed to be publicly named. But in the last decade, this 40-something-year-old has morphed into one of the most dominant figures in the Irish underworld, and his gang is suspected of being behind up to 16 murders. The rumour has always been that his right-hand man, Ken Finn, was the one who pulled the trigger on both Alan and Vincent Ryan. Also big on the gangland scene were Cornelius Price and Owen Maguire, both members of the travelling community and lifelong friends. Price, in particular, had a fearsome reputation. You might remember the tragic disappearance of a young couple in April 2015, Willie Maugham and his pregnant partner Anna Verslavan. They were last seen alive at a compound in Gormanston in County Meath, where Price was mostly based, and where it's believed he and his gang murdered Maugham and his girlfriend before cremating their bodies on top of a bonfire. Maugham's family have since told how they think Price killed them because he feared Willie was going to tell all he knew about the shooting dead of Benny Whitehouse in 2014 in Balbriggan, which was part of another criminal feud. In a further disgusting twist, after Maugham's father made a heartbreaking plea on social media, begging anyone for information that might lead to the discovery of his son's body. In retaliation for this public appeal, Price had his other son's grave in Tala dug up and desecrated. Maugham's daughter's house was also firebombed, and the family continued to be threatened and intimidated for years. In February of 2017, Price was jailed for 3 years after being found guilty of recklessly engaging in conduct that created a substantial risk of death or harm. He'd driven his car at a Garda. And it's around this time that the Drogheda feud, in which Robbie Lawler became all tangled up, began in earnest. With Price now in prison, his old pal, Owen Maguire, was left exposed. For years, he had been top dog of the drug gang heap in Drogheda, a very lucrative market that others wanted to muscle in on. One of those intent on carving out a big slice of the pie for himself was veteran criminal Richie Carberry, a major drugs trafficker who moved out of Coolock to a new home with his family in Bettystown, County Meath, a seaside village just about 10 kilometres from Drogheda. And this is exactly where Robbie Lawler jumps into the picture, because Carberry was married to Lawler's sister Eileen, and the two were very close associates. When a major drug gang in Drogheda split in two in 2017, it left two brothers on one side and Owen Maguire on the other. Carberry firmly pinned his allegiance to the brothers' faction, helping to supply them with drugs and weapons. For more than a year, there was a spate of attacks on members of both sides, with unspeakable life-altering injuries meted out and several homes destroyed as the community around them looked on in horror. By 2018, Carberry roped his brother-in-law into the melee, and Lawler has since been named in court of law as the man who shot Owen Maguire 6 times at a halting site in Drogheda in July of that year. Maguire survived, but was left permanently paralysed and now uses a wheelchair. Many believe that Lawler meant to kill Maguire, which is why, they say, he lifted his balaclava and showed him his face before pumping the final shot into him. It's also possible, given Lawler's track record, that he actually meant to maim him for life and that he planned to publicly mock him about his injuries, which would have helped add to his reputation as a psychopath. Already, it was a pretty extraordinary reputation. He was feared for sure, but he was also loathed, and his list of powerful enemies was growing by the week. Just a few months earlier, he'd assassinated Ken Finn, Mr. Big's right-hand man, who I mentioned a little earlier. Now, Lawler shot Finn in the head as he was sitting in his car outside his house in Coolock, and for 2 days, Finn was kept on life support with a bullet lodged in his brain.
Ken Finn was one of those guys who was not very well known to the media, but he had a ferocious reputation in North Dublin. He was Mr. Big's hitman for hire in reality. Very, very close to Mr. Big, very close personal friends. When Mr. Big decided to take out Alan Ryan, he trusted Ken Finn to do the job. If that was one of the most high-profile murders of the last decade, and Ken Finn was one of those guys who there was a great fear about him. He was a soldier, really, a gangland soldier. He would have known Robbie Lawler for over a decade. They would have been close, but at the time he was shot dead, Richie Carberry had decided that because of Mr. Big's association with the Maguire-Price faction, that Kenneth Finn was probably the most dangerous man operating on that side, and that Robbie Lawler had to take him out. It was really a case of kill or be killed.
Mr. Big didn't go to Finn's funeral, but his presence was keenly felt throughout the ceremony, as Finn was remembered as a loyal friend whose death would not be forgotten. It was a message that Lawler would have been wise to listen to. In the meantime, Richie Carberry was becoming a major target for several drug lords. He was suspected of supplying the weapons used in the gun attack on Owen Maguire, and had failed to pay a debt of around, they say, €700,000 to Mr. Big. But because he'd the loyal services of one of the most notorious killers in the country, namely his brother-in-law, Robbie Lawler, he kind of felt protected. Lawler, however, was in the middle of a downward spiral of mental health issues, in large part, I suppose, thanks to his cocaine use and his steroid addiction. Shortly after killing Finn, he'd gone on an around-the-world trip with several members of his family. A series of bizarre videos posted to his social media accounts show him visiting several historical religious sites in places like Bethlehem and Rome. Online viewers were quick to mock the reverence this notoriously violent gangster showed as he went on tours of various churches. And there was also this sort of strange video showing him handing out football strips to a crowd of young boys, insisting they pull the jerseys on before posing up beside him. Perhaps it was an attempt to build himself up as some sort of crime boss with a strong altruistic streak. But we'll probably never know what was going on in his mind. One thing was for sure, he was clearly losing it. After returning home, he turned his sights on his now ex-partner, Rachel Kerwin, her new boyfriend, Derek Mitchell, and his innocent mum, Fiona. Furious that Kerwin had moved on with her life and that Mitchell was close to his children, Lawler embarked on a terrifying assault on his love rival and his mum. You've been listening to Double Cross, the Murder of Robbie Lawler. This podcast is produced by Nicola Tallant and Ian Malini for Crime World Presents. Clodagh Meany and Alison Morris are assistant producers. The script is by Jane Finnegan. Graphics are by Enda Bulger. This podcast is based on the book Web of Betrayal by me, Nicola Tallant. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.